Hello sewing friends and welcome back. I'm the Catsews and I wanted to share with you all how I made my Valentine's Day dress. So the reason I decided to make a Valentine's Day dress was that I saw there was a competition being run over on Instagram called Me Made Valentines 2021. It was run by Stitch Fits, Sew Bake Make, Alyssa Threads, and makers_com. I will put everyone's details down below just in case I messed that up because I'm pretty sure I did. But anyway, they were running a competition to make your own Valentine's Day outfit. And I saw this and I was interested, but I wasn't anticipating making anything, so I kind of let it mull in the back of my head for a while. And then a week and a half before Valentine's Day, I decided to make my own dress. I had some of the fabric that I needed and I had an idea in my head, and I had been wanting to make this anyway, so I thought it was a good time, and that way I would have a nice dress to wear on Valentine's Day. So that's all well and good, except of course I left myself a week and a half to get the additional fabric that I needed and sew it together. So bit of a stress sewing period, but there's nothing if not a very close deadline to motivate you a lot. And this tends to be my area of expertise, is waiting way too late to start something and then stress sewing it. So if you need any tips, hit me up. Unfortunately, things did not go to plan. The dress went well, the dress was great. I did post it over on Instagram as well if you would like to see it. But my Valentine's Day plans didn't exactly happen as I wanted them to. So my partner and I have been together for 6 years, and in that time, we have never once had a Valentine's Day date on the day. Either someone's been working, or in the case of last year, I went to the Alice Cooper concert on Valentine's Day, and he doesn't like Alice Cooper, so there's that. That seems like a him problem though. But so we were very, very excited to actually spend a Valentine's Day together. We don't super buy into the whole commercialization of Valentine's Day, but personally, I think it's a good excuse to set aside some time to spend with the people you love, whether that's a friend, a romantic partner, or your family. You know, it's a good excuse to be like, oh, Valentine's Day is coming up. You know what? I haven't seen this person in a while. I should make some time to see them. That's what I think Valentine's Day should be. I know that it's not always that, but I think that's what it should be. For the first time in 6 years, we planned a whole day of it. You know, we were going to have a nice lunch and go shopping on the mountain and have a walk in the forest and go out for a nice dinner, and I was going to wear my dress. And then Victoria went into lockdown. So I live in Australia. Victoria has done exceptionally well throughout the COVID pandemic, mostly because of our state premier, who, quite frankly, the Prime Minister of our country has done nothing to help the country during this time. If it were up to him, we would have focused on keeping the country open for the economy, because everyone getting really, really sick and not being able to work definitely doesn't harm the economy. Oh no. Anyway, thanks to our state premier, the state actually went through a pretty heavy lockdown last year that enabled essential businesses to keep working and businesses to keep working from home, but it also kept people safe. And that meant that our case numbers practically went to zero, and we've dealt with some small outbreaks because we do still have people coming into the country. And hotel quarantine is not 100%, but for the most part we've been really, really safe. You know, no one I know has gotten COVID, and that is amazing. And I really am very grateful that that is the situation that I'm living in. So unfortunately, we do have an outbreak at the moment as I'm filming this. Whether or not we still have one when you eventually see the video is another matter. But we do have an outbreak at the moment, and it's one of those strains of the super contagious coronavirus, which spreads very quickly. So our state premier is concerned and our health authorities are concerned, and so they shut the state down for 5 days, 2 days before Valentine's Day. So all of our lovely plans for the first time ever were completely wiped. To be fair, I support the lockdown. I'm just upset that it happened when it did. My parents were literally on the freeway going to their long weekend for Valentine's Day when they heard the news and they had to turn around and come home, which is devastating. So terrible timing, but still a good decision overall. Anyway, that being said, I'm still going to show you my Valentine's Day makes. I still posted about it because I'm super proud of this dress, even if I didn't get to wear it. I will get to wear it on a makeup date, I'm sure. So, it wouldn't be the Catsews if I didn't talk about Gretchen Hirsch at least once. I used the Gertie's Ultimate Book Dress to make this dress. I combined the strapless bodice with the sweetheart neckline with the pencil skirt, so essentially following with the fringed cocktail dress pattern. This is what I made. So this has princess seams and a fairly standard pencil skirt with darts for shaping, and I combined the two. I did use the pattern that I had already graded up when I made my skirts using this, which I've also made a video about, not the grading process. So this pattern is pretty graded. It goes from like a 14 in the hips to a 10. I told you I had a good like hip to waist ratio, and that's what it is. So yeah, this was definitely graded. I definitely did a mock-up. So fabric that I was working with is a beautiful eyelet cotton. I actually purchased this from Pit Trading ages ago. You may have seen my sewing haul video where I showed it to you, and I figured I had about 2 meters of it, which was going to be just enough to make a pattern like this, and I finally got to use it. And I purchased a white cotton sateen from Spotlight just as an interlining, but white fabric I always find is going to be see-through, so I did 2 layers of the white fabric and 1 layer of the cotton eyelet. So it's a thick dress, but overall I think it turned out great. I'm very, very pleased with it. Also, when I announced my sewing plans for this in my 2021 sewing plans video, I did actually get some really, really lovely messages with some recommendations for patterns, so thank you if you hit me up with a pattern recommendation. I did have a very strong idea of what this dress was going to be in my mind, but now I have some very lovely patterns to check out for the next time I go to make a dress. With that all said, I'm going to take you through the making process. I highly recommend that you guys check out the accounts I mentioned earlier, and definitely check out the hashtag #MeMadeValentines2021 because I think it is awesome. There are so many amazing makes in there, and definitely don't forget to add your own if you made your own Valentine's Day outfit. So with that all being said, I think we can move on to the making process now. I hope you guys enjoy. So of course, starting out by cutting my fabric. As mentioned, I have this gorgeous embroidered cotton eyelet from Pit Trading. The embroidery is blue and it has white base, and it is so lovely. But I really shouldn't have to say this, but apparently I needed to say it to myself because I did not. If you are working with a limited amount of fabric like I was, I had about 2 meters of this, and let me tell you, it was a limited 2 meters. So I thought I had plenty of fabric, which I totally did, but I should have planned out the cutting of all of my pieces before I started, because I did not, and that meant that I needed to try and fit the back piece of my skirt on a much smaller piece than intended, and unfortunately I had to trim my hem down in order to make it work. And you will see Claudie flitting in and out of frame as I do this. Every time I get down on the floor, which is basically the only surface I have big enough to actually cut out pattern pieces and fabric, she always comes over and wants to know what I'm doing, which is a bit hazardous when you have a rotary cutter or some scissors. So she is generally always around and has to get moved out of the way, and she never understands why. But moving on, so once I had cut out my single layer of my cotton eyelet, I actually cut out 2 layers of my cotton sateen. I wanted 2 layers of the white cotton sateen because it is white and it was a little bit see-through, so I wanted the 2 layers for complete opacity. However, I think with the busy print of the cotton eyelet and the blue and everything that was going on in the first layer, I really didn't need the 2 layers of the white underneath. And honestly, it just made the dress a bit too thick. So probably if it was the cotton sateen by itself, definitely 2 layers, but with the cotton eyelet overlay, it really didn't need the extra one, and I totally could have just done 2 layers. But unfortunately now I relied on not unfortunately, I can totally take it out, but I relied on the lining, as you'll see, to enclose all of my raw edges. So taking it out now would mean figuring out ways to finish the remaining edges and like annoyingly overlocking everything while the garment's already finished. So I'm pretty happy with the way it is, but yes, basically this is just to say it got a bit too thick, so 1 layer of cotton sateen would have been totally fine. And then of course you need to mark your pattern pieces, a process which is always made easier if you have a little feline friend around to help. So I generally mark out the balance points, and occasionally I will also add in an initial for each of the pieces, just so I can keep track of what's what, particularly when pieces start to look very, very similar, like the back pieces have a very similar shape. So I find it's just easiest to mark them down. The balance points do serve 2 purposes. They can kind of help you mark down those pieces and figure out what's what and how it connects to other pieces. And also when you're working with princess seams, I think balance marks are quite important. They'll just help you make sure that those curves match up where they should. So the final prep step before I start sewing is pinning my first layer of cotton eyelet to my second layer of cotton sateen. I wanted the sateen to act like an interlining for my cotton eyelet, which would mean that all my raw seams would be completely on the inside of the garment, and it would also make the cotton eyelet a little bit easier to sew because I wouldn't be dealing with all the gaps when I was trying to piece things together. So I'm just going through and pinning everything together here, and then I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and basically just sew all around the edges. Another way that you could do this is, you don't have to sew everything together, you can just layer them. But I wanted to ensure that things weren't moving or shifting around. Another way you could do this is basically hand sewing all of the pieces together. I did find that with the machine, things got moved around a little bit, which was a little frustrating because that meant that sometimes my edges wouldn't line up exactly. It didn't actually affect anything as far as I can tell in the actual making process. I didn't have any problems sewing anything together, so as far as I can tell, it's fine. But it might be better to hand sew this just so things aren't moving around and shifting underneath the presser foot. Whatever way works for you. The only other thing to note here is that when I was sewing everything together, I sewed it at 1/4 inch just so that nothing would show on the outside, because I wasn't planning on removing these stitches, so I really just wanted to make sure that they were completely invisible. And once that was all done, I could actually begin sewing. So I'm starting with the bodice, and I'm piecing all of my back pieces and side back pieces together, and I'm also piecing all of my front pieces and side front pieces together. And I'm doing this for all of my single layer cotton sateen lining pieces and my now interlined cotton eyelet pieces. It's important to note here that I'm starting with these seams because there are no darts in the bodice pieces because we have the princess seams. They're going to provide the shape that we need. However, for my skirt pieces, I'm going to pin my darts. And once again, I do this by pinning along the sewing line, basically, and making sure that that pin runs through both sides of the sewing line. That makes it much easier for me to line up darts, because I actually kind of struggle doing this. I don't understand how people can just like fold a dart in half and sew it without pinning it. And I also don't understand how people can pin them like sideways and still get excellent results. Anyway, this is the way that works for me, so this is how I pin my darts. And once all of that's done, we can actually start sewing pieces together. So I didn't have any trouble sewing the interlined cotton eyelet pieces together. I think it helped that the cotton sateen was actually on the sides that went up against the sewing machine, so it provided a very smooth surface for the presser foot and the feed dogs to run over. So I was quite pleased with how this went. I didn't have any bunching issues or problems with the cotton eyelet moving around. I think it certainly helps that I had already sewn the cotton eyelet and my cotton sateen pieces together. And I also think it was helpful to have the cotton sateen be the inner layer, which actually meant that with right sides together, it was on the outside when it came to sewing it. I also very happily did not have any issues with my darts. Again, a trick you could do here is to baste along the dart lines to join your pieces of fabric together. But honestly, I just folded them as usual. Again, everything was sewn around the edges, but I hadn't actually done any stitching on in the middle of my pieces of fabric. So I was quite pleased that I didn't have any dart problems, particularly when it came to the bottom of the dart. Those points were still really sharp, no issues at all. And I probably don't need to say it, but I'm going to say it. I gave everything a really, really good press. So when it came to pressing my darts for my front piece, I pressed both of my darts towards the edges of the fabric, so towards the sides, and for my back piece I pressed them towards the back seam. And then I just used my tailor's ham to help me get those nice curves in the princess seam of the bodice. Now, something that I had a bit of trouble with, hence this little section. Basically, I wanted to grade my pattern from a size 14 at the hips to a size 10 at the waist, but I already had a pattern piece that was a size 14 at the hips and a size 12 at the waist. I just wanted to bring it in a little bit. And when I tried to figure out how to trim down that pattern, because I basically didn't want to redraw it, I was being a bit lazy. I kind of struggled to figure out how much I should trim it by, because using my bodice pattern pieces, I couldn't really see much of a difference. And it turned out to be like a minuscule, maybe 1/8 of an inch on each pattern piece, but it still adds up. So what I did was I took my now back piece and my side back piece that are now seamed together, and I compared those to the back piece of my skirt, and I just trimmed down the excess along the side seams. And that was all I did. I still wanted my edges to line up and everything, so I trimmed down the side seams and made sure that everything else matched. And of course I did this for my front and front side pieces and my front skirt piece. I basically could only really do this once my bodice pieces were seamed together, because I think the seam allowance might have been throwing me off. I needed everything to be quite precise. One day I might go back and properly grade this pattern piece so I don't have to do this again in the future, but honestly this is a half decent method for adjusting and grading. And all I did was I measured 2 inches down, and then from that point I curved things inwards so that they would match up with my side seams. And honestly, this worked really, really well. I was really pleased with how this came out. And then my final step for this process was to fold my front skirt piece in half and make sure the 2 side seams they matched, and then join up my back pieces as well and make sure that the curve was even on both sides. And once that was done, I could actually start sewing up my side seams. So, I mean, obviously it's quite important to do that step before you sew up your side seams. And it's also important to remember to do it, because I did get initially. I actually sewed up all of my side seams, including my skirt side seams, and then I had to unpin everything, which was devastating. But anyway, that's all fixed now. So just joining the fronts and backs of my bodice and the fronts and backs of my skirt so that I can get sewing. And I do this again for all of my single layer lining pieces and my interlined cotton eyelet pieces. And then I started sewing them together. So all of my seams have been sewn with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Something that I thought I might do because I wasn't sure if this would fit me really well, and I was conscious that with 3 layers of fabric it was going to be kind of bulky. So I actually started off by sewing the side seams at 3/8 of an inch because I was a little bit worried about the additional bulk. But after doing that and trying it on, I found that the dress was way too loose. So I just went in and sewed up those side seams, again with the correct 5/8 of an inch. So yes, as it turns out, I didn't have any issues with the additional bulk, and I just ended up taking these side seams back to where they should have been originally. And after giving all of my seams a very good press, I was able to start connecting my bodice and my skirt pieces together. When pinning my bodice and skirt pieces, I matched up my seams and my darts. Basically, because this is a princess seamed bodice, you want to align your front seams with your front darts and your back piece seams with your back darts, and side seams should align as usual. I started by finding the center point of my bodice and my skirt and basically moving outwards from there, aligning my seams as I went, and then could move over to my sewing machine and just sew these seams up with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance as per usual. It's quite important as you're sewing these seams to make sure that everything's lying nice and flat, including your seam allowances and your darts, and that your darts don't get pushed into a different direction that you originally pressed to them, because this can sometimes happen. I find that where my little feed dogs start, there is a bit of a ledge, and sometimes seam allowances or darts can be pushed away from that ledge into the opposite direction that they were when you started. So I kept a very careful eye to make sure this didn't happen. And then, of course, pressing my middle seam. Now, I didn't do this as usual. Normally with these particular seams that join the bodice and the skirt, you're instructed to press them upwards into the bodice. But because I was working with 3 layers of fabric, I actually pressed them completely flat to try and reduce that bulk on my waist, and also to make a zipper insertion a little bit easier. Speaking of, my final step before I can insert my zipper is to sew up my back seam. So I started off by measuring the length of my zipper, and because the top of my dress is not yet finished, I measured from the points that extend past the top all the way down to the little metal bar that closes the zipper. You don't want to go past this because you want to make sure that the back seam is closed up enough to avoid that little gap at the bottom below where the zipper teeth will finish. So once I found that point, I pinned downwards, and I only pinned part of the vent. So the vent is the portion of a pencil skirt towards the base of the back hem that is left open to make walking easier, basically. And there is a bit of additional fabric in the seam, which, to be honest, I'm not really certain of the purpose of. I think it's just so that your seam allowance isn't visible if the vent flips outwards, which it tends to do when you're walking. So you do want to sew some of that vent closed just at the very top, but you want to leave the remainder open. And then once that's done and all pressed, we can start with our zipper insertion. So I'm inserting a lapped zipper into this garment. I suppose it does have a bit more of a vintage feel, which is why Gertie's clothing tends to include lap zippers. But also B, lap zippers I feel very comfortable with. I've never sewn an invisible zip, and
they are very, very intimidating to me. So the first thing you want to do is press your underlap. This is generally, if you have your dress right side out and you're looking at the back of it, it's generally on the right side. But to be completely honest, you don't actually need to have it on any particular side. It doesn't really matter, just so long as you're happy with how it works. So you want to press down the underlap side by 1/2 inch. So not your complete 5/8, just 1/2 inch. And then you sew your zipper underneath it. You align the edge of your now pressed seam to the zipper teeth, and you basically just sew down until you get to the middle part. About halfway through, I generally then pull the zipper completely closed. So all I do is I leave my needle down, I lift up my presser foot, and then I zip the zip shut, and then keep sewing. And then you want to press your overlap side, and you want to press this at the 5/8 of an inch. This one is a little bit trickier to sew because, again, you need to leave the zipper open just to get started, but this does make aligning your seams a little bit difficult. So I definitely recommend pinning it. And this should sit completely over the zipper, and it should basically match up with where the stitching line for the underlap side is. So your zipper will be completely covered. And then you just go down and you sew this again as close to the zipper teeth as you can. So a lot of this zip is sewn by feel when it comes to the overlap side, but it's not as scary as it seems. It is actually decently easy to deal with. And now I can actually insert my lining. So throughout this entire process, I've kept them separate for several reasons, but to make things a bit easier for me, but also because my lining is going to act as the finisher for the top of my bodice. So when I sewed my zipper, I left that little bit above where the zipper teeth stop, and I aligned that with the top of my fabric. That meant that I could sew on my lining at 5/8 of an inch, and that would enclose that last bit of the zipper. So I've pinned my lining to my dress right sides together as per usual. Importantly, I've already pressed back the open back seams of my lining fabric so that it doesn't interfere with my zipper. I would recommend pressing them back an additional 1/4 of an inch than the main dress seams were pressed. That way you just have that little bit of extra room so that your lining completely avoids your zipper. I did it just as the dress was pressed, and I found that I had some issues there. And then, yeah, just going along and sewing along that top edge of my dress at 5/8 of an inch. Once I finished sewing the top of my dress, I then went down and trimmed down the seam allowance quite substantially. I knew that there was potentially going to be a lot of bulk here with 3 layers of fabric and turned over on itself, so I wanted to reduce that bulk as much as possible. I did trim my seam allowance just straight as is, but another way you could do this is trim basically one edge to 1/4 of an inch and then the other edge to 1/2 an inch, and that will also reduce the bulk quite considerably because you won't have all of the layers sitting at the same length. Then from there I turned the lining to the inside of my dress and gave the top a really good press. Another way to assist this process would possibly be to understitch the seam allowance to the lining. I made an effort to ensure that the lining was kept to the inside of the dress so it wasn't visible from the outside at all, and I think understitching possibly would have helped that a great deal, but you know that I hate understitching, and to be honest I didn't think of it at the time. And then I went through and top stitched that top edge of my dress just to make sure that everything remains nice and crisp and the lining doesn't turn to the outside of the fabric. I did this at 1/4 of an inch, but I had my needle set to the right side, which I've found is one of the best methods to get quite close to that edge. You still have that presser foot there to help guide you, but with your needle set to the right, things are a bit easier. And I really took my time over those seams because honestly, there was a lot of fabric at that point. I was really worried about a needle breaking, which has happened in the past with fabric that gets a bit too thick for your needle, for my needle rather. But I didn't have any issues this time around, thank goodness for that. And now we come to the final steps of making this dress. I'm going to move on to doing my hem, and the first thing I need to do is press open my vent just to ensure that that seam is taken care of, and then I can go ahead and press up my hem. I pressed my lining hem slightly shorter than I did my main dress hem. That way it would be a bit easier to keep the lining on the inside. So I pressed my lining hem up by a whole inch, and I pressed my dress hem by 3/4 of an inch. This was mostly dictated by my fabric. As mentioned, I ended up having to cut my back skirt pieces on less than ideal pieces of fabric because I messed up a little bit with the planning of my cutting. So I actually had the selvage of the embroidery to deal with, where basically the embroidery ended probably about 1.5 inches up from the hem. So I had already trimmed this down a little bit, which meant that my hem was probably 1.5 inches shorter than I wanted it to be, and instead of sitting at my knees, it sat slightly above my knees. But again, just lessons in learning to actually lay out your pattern pieces before you cut your fabric when you're dealing with very limited amounts. And once I was done with my hem, I moved over to my straps. So I wanted these to look like the dress. I wanted the white to be underneath and the blue eyelet to be the top layer. I should have just done these with the blue eyelet, but I was worried about turning them out. As it turns out, turning them out was not easier having the white cotton sateen on the inside. The amount of times I turned them out and somehow ended up with two separate bits that were joined in the middle, but they were two individual loops. It drove me insane. So I did not film the turning out process of this because it took me about 4 hours to actually turn them out, and that sounds bonkers. I destroyed my loop turner in the process. It was a whole thing. I did not have a good time with these straps. But anyway, when I went to place them, I placed them 1 inch to the outside of my princess seam, so kind of towards the side seams. And I should have done the same with the back portions of my straps, but I didn't. So I placed them 1 inch inwards of my back seams towards the zipper, but I should have placed them 1 inch inwards towards my side seams. Unfortunately, this was one area where the instruction said one thing and my brain did the opposite thing, but I eventually got them into place, and I did have to hand sew some of them down just because I ended up adjusting them. I do recommend trying the dress on and then pinning your straps in place, or at the very least sewing the back or front and then trying the dress on and finalizing where you want the other end of the strap to. And once I finished my straps, I could complete the final touches to my dress, which involved sewing the lining into place. So basically along the zipper and the hem, I wanted to sew the lining to the main dress. Mostly the zipper so that the lining doesn't get caught or interfere with the zipper at all, but also I didn't want the lining to be loose from the rest of the dress. I did want it to be attached. And attaching it to my hem meant that all of my raw seams would be completely enclosed, which is again part of the reason why I decided to do a lining, though as I've discovered, it probably would have just been easier to overlock the pieces and not have this third layer to my skirt. At the very least, I probably would have stuck with the lining to the bodice, that way I could easily finish the top hem. Top hem? Yeah, I suppose that's correct. The top portion of my dress. But I probably definitely didn't need that additional layer to the skirt of my dress. But nonetheless, I'm quite enjoying getting a bit of extra time with hand sewing. I'm definitely getting better and faster with it, which is really great. Even though it does take So long. My goodness, you think the difference between like buying a pair of pants and making a pair of pants is quite astronomical. I can't imagine hand sewing a pair of pants, though I know maybe not pants, but I know a lot of people hand sew entire garments, and kudos to them. I am not that patient. But I've definitely actually kind of appreciated these little bits of hand sewing that I get to do of an evening. They've been really quite nice. And that, friends, concludes the making of this dress. I am so very pleased with how it turned out. It is exactly what I wanted, and it is sure to get a lot of wear in the future.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed that and found it useful. Please let me know what your Valentine's Day makes were, or let me know what you're currently working on. I would love to hear about it. As always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to see more of them. And you can also connect with me over on Instagram at thecatsews, where you can also check out the hashtag #MeMadeValentines2021 if you're so interested. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Happy sewing, everyone.